The leak had been dripping for 2 weeks, staining the bedroom ceiling with an expanding brown circle that suggested the roof damage was worse than Michael Torres had initially thought. He'd been ignoring it the way he ignored most maintenance issues with the old Victorian house in Portland, Maine, telling himself he'd get to it when his disability check cleared or when he had energy that seemed perpetually depleted. But this morning the drip had accelerated to a steady stream, and Michael accepted he couldn't defer the repair any longer. The attic access was in the upstairs hallway, a pull-down ladder he'd never actually used in the 18 months since buying this house with his VA loan and the settlement from his medical discharge. Beside him, as he positioned the ladder, watching with the patient attention she brought to everything, Luna sat in perfect stillness. The Border Collie mix was 6 years old, 40 pounds of intelligence and loyalty that had served alongside Michael for 4 years in Army military intelligence before a roadside bomb in Syria had ended both their careers. She'd lost partial hearing in her right ear from the blast, and Michael had lost most of the use of his left leg below the knee. They'd been medically separated together, had gone through rehab together, and now lived together in this drafty house that represented the closest thing to stability either had known since leaving active duty. Michael climbed the ladder carefully, his prosthetic leg making the ascent awkward but manageable, and pushed open the attic hatch. Stale air rushed down, carrying the smell of old wood and insulation and something else, a scent he couldn't quite identify, but that made Luna whine softly from below. He pulled himself up into the attic space, flashlight in hand, and immediately understood why the leak had gotten so bad. A section of the roof showed water damage extending at least 8 feet from where the drip was visible downstairs. The wood was darkened and soft, the shingles above probably compromised for months or years before Michael had bought the place. The home inspection had noted potential roof concerns, but had missed the extent of the damage, and now Michael was looking at repairs that would probably cost more than he had available in his savings account. He played his flashlight across the rafters, assessing the damage and trying to calculate whether he could patch it himself or needed to hire a professional. The beam caught something unexpected near the far gable wall, a large object covered in canvas that didn't match the usual attic detritus of forgotten furniture and stored boxes. Michael worked his way across the attic floor, careful to step only on joists to avoid putting weight on old plaster, and pulled back the canvas to reveal what it covered. A mirror. Massive and ornate, perhaps 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide, framed in what looked like hand-carved mahogany, with intricate patterns that suggested significant craftsmanship and age. The glass was remarkably clear despite what must be decades or possibly centuries of storage, showing no signs of the silvering deterioration that marked most antique mirrors. Michael couldn't imagine how it had gotten up here, couldn't picture anyone maneuvering something this heavy through the narrow attic access. He stood before the mirror and saw his reflection looking back, a man of 38 who looked older, his dark hair showing premature grey and his face carrying lines that marked 4 tours in combat zones. His service had been intelligence analysis mostly, working with interrogation teams and translating intercepted communications, but he'd seen enough combat and enough horror that the lines felt earned rather than premature. Behind his reflection, the attic stretched away in shadows, and Michael was about to turn back to examine the roof damage when his reflection moved independently. Not a large movement, just a shift of posture that Michael hadn't made, a turning of the head that his actual body hadn't performed. He froze, watching his reflection with sudden, intense focus, and saw it happen again. His reflection raised its right hand, while Michael's right hand stayed at his side. The reflection smiled while Michael's face remained neutral. For 3 seconds, Michael tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Delayed reflection, light distortion, neurological episode caused by the medications he took for chronic pain. But none of those explanations matched what his eyes reported. This wasn't malfunction or hallucination. This was his reflection acting independently, moving in ways that should have been impossible unless the mirror showed something other than simple reflection of present reality. His reflection pointed, a deliberate gesture towards something behind Michael's position. He turned to look, saw nothing but rafters and insulation, and when he turned back to the mirror, his reflection was writing something. Not physically writing. There was no pen or paper in the reflected attic, but text was appearing in the mirror's surface, as though written by invisible hand. "Check the trunk behind you." Michael spun around, heart hammering with adrenaline that his military training had taught him to channel into focused response. There was a trunk. He'd passed it on his way to the mirror but hadn't given it attention. It was old steamer trunk, leather straps and brass fittings, sitting against the wall about 15 feet from where he stood. He approached it carefully, opened the lid with expectation of something significant, and found documents. Old papers, journals, letters bound with ribbon that had aged from red to brown. Michael lifted out the top journal and opened it to the first page, which was dated 1887, and written in elegant script that read, "The mirror came into my possession today, purchased from an estate sale in Boston. The previous owner's family claims it shows the future, though I am skeptical of such assertions. I shall investigate these claims methodically and record my findings herein." The journal continued for dozens of pages, documenting experiments and observations by someone named Nathaniel Blackwood, who'd apparently owned this house in the late 19th century. The entries described using the mirror to see forward in time, testing its accuracy by observing events shown in the mirror, and then waiting for those events to occur in reality. Nathaniel's initial skepticism gave way to amazed acceptance, as his observations confirmed the mirror consistently showed true future events, sometimes days ahead, sometimes weeks, occasionally even years. But the journal also documented something darker. Nathaniel had seen his own death in the mirror, watched himself die in a carriage accident that the mirror showed would happen in winter of 1889. The entries became increasingly desperate as that date approached, Nathaniel trying everything to prevent what the mirror had shown, while also documenting each failed attempt. The final entry, dated December 15th, 1889, simply read, "Tomorrow. The mirror was correct. I've accepted this now. To whoever finds this journal, be careful what you seek to see. Some knowledge carries weight too heavy for mortal minds to bear comfortably." Michael set down the journal with hands that shook slightly. If this was authentic, if the mirror actually showed the future as Nathaniel claimed, then what Michael had just seen was himself in the mirror, his future self trying to send a message back to his present self. The text had said to check the trunk, which had led him to this journal, which explained what the mirror could do. He returned to the mirror slowly, approaching it the way he'd approached potential IEDs during his service, with caution and respect for danger he didn't fully understand. His reflection showed him standing in front of the mirror again, but the scene wasn't quite matching his actual position. The reflection showed him from slightly different angle, showed the attic lit differently as though sunlight came through the gable window when in reality the morning was overcast. And his reflection was doing something with its hands, gestures that looked like sign language. Michael had learned basic ASL during his intelligence work, enough to conduct simple conversations during operations where silence was necessary. He watched his reflection sign slowly, deliberately. "I am you. 24 hours ahead. You need to see what comes. Trust the mirror. Prepare." Michael signed back, his hands moving awkwardly through forms he hadn't used in years. Prepare for what? The reflection's answer chilled him. "Everything changes tomorrow. Watch and learn." The reflection then gestured to the mirror itself, and Michael understood he was being told to look not at his reflection, but through it, to focus on seeing the future, rather than the present being reflected. He'd read in Nathaniel's journal that this required intention, that you had to want to see forward in time for the mirror to show you anything beyond simple reflection. Michael focused, directing his intention toward seeing tomorrow, toward understanding what his future self meant by "everything changes." The mirror's surface rippled like water, the reflection dissolving into something else entirely. He was seeing the attic still, but different. Boxes had been moved, the trunk was open, and most significantly there were people. 3 men in dark suits, moving through the space with clear purpose, examining the mirror and taking photographs. One of them was speaking into a phone. "Yes, we've confirmed it. The Blackwood mirror thought to be lost. We need a secure transport team immediately." The scene shifted, and Michael saw himself, or rather his future self, watching this from behind a stack of boxes. Future Michael looked frightened and determined in equal measure, and Luna was pressed against his leg with hackles raised. As Michael watched through the mirror, one of the men in suits noticed future Michael's hiding spot and called out, "Mr. Torres, we know you're there. Please come out. We just want to talk about the mirror's provenance and your intentions regarding its preservation." Future Michael didn't move, and the scene in the mirror faded back to simple reflection. Michael found himself staring at his present self again, his mind racing through implications. If what he'd just seen was real, if tomorrow would bring men in suits looking for this mirror, then he had less than 24 hours to decide what to do about it. Hide the mirror, report it to authorities, try to use it for personal gain, or something else entirely. Luna's barking from below broke his concentration, and Michael realized he'd been standing in front of the mirror for what felt like minutes, but might have been much longer. He descended the ladder carefully, his prosthetic leg making him awkward again, and found Luna at the bottom looking agitated in ways she only showed when she sensed danger or significant change approaching. "What is it, girl?" He knelt beside her, scratching behind her ears, but she wouldn't settle. She kept looking up at the attic access, whining softly, her body rigid with alert tension. Dogs could sense things humans missed. Michael knew that from his service. Luna had alerted to threats before he'd consciously registered them, more times than he could count. If she was upset about the attic, about the mirror, then her instincts were warning of something his rational mind hadn't fully processed. He pulled out his phone and searched for information about mirrors that showed the future, about Nathaniel Blackwood, about anything that might give context for what he'd just found. The search returned mostly fiction and mythology, stories about scrying mirrors and prophetic visions. Nothing that suggested functional precognitive devices actually existed, but he did find historical records for Nathaniel Blackwood, confirming he'd been a wealthy merchant who'd owned this house from 1885 until his death in 1889. The death certificate listed cause as injuries sustained in carriage accident, matching what Nathaniel's journal had predicted, so that part was real at least. Nathaniel had existed, had died as his journal suggested, and the mirror had apparently shown him that death accurately, which meant the mirror might genuinely show the future, and what Michael had just seen about men in suits arriving tomorrow might be accurate prediction rather than anxiety-induced hallucination. He needed to think, needed to process this rationally, despite the surreal nature of what he'd discovered. If you're following along with this story, and wondering what you'd do if you found a mirror that showed your future, you might want to subscribe to see how Michael handles what comes next, because the decisions he makes in the next few hours will determine whether he loses everything or gains knowledge that could change his entire life. Hit that subscribe button, give this a like if the setup has you hooked, and share it with someone who'd appreciate thinking about whether we'd really want to know our futures, if given the chance. Michael spent the rest of the day researching everything he could find about precognitive devices, temporal mechanics, and the specific history of his house. The Portland Historical Society had records showing the Victorian had been built in 1883 by Nathaniel Blackwood using wealth from his shipping business. After Nathaniel's death, the house had passed through several families, none staying more than a few years, all citing vague reasons for leaving that documents described as atmospheric concerns or unsuitable conditions. That pattern suggested previous occupants had discovered the mirror and been disturbed enough by what they'd seen to abandon the property. Michael was beginning to understand why. Even the brief glimpse he'd gotten of tomorrow, of men in suits searching his attic, carried weight that pressed against his thoughts uncomfortably. What else might the mirror show? What other futures could he see if he spent more time looking? The temptation pulled at him constantly, the desire to go back up to the attic and look further ahead, to see not just tomorrow, but next week, next month, next year. But Nathaniel's journal had warned against exactly that impulse, suggesting that too much knowledge of the future created burdens the human mind wasn't designed to carry. Knowing his own death date had apparently driven Nathaniel to desperation, and Michael had no desire to repeat that experience. Around 6 p.m., Michael made a decision. He'd document the mirror thoroughly, photograph it and Nathaniel's journal, and prepare to report it to whoever those men in suits represented. If they were coming for it anyway, if tomorrow would bring them to his attic regardless of what he did tonight, then trying to hide or profit from the mirror seemed pointless. Better to cooperate, to be seen as helpful civilian rather than someone trying to exploit or conceal something of apparent significance. But first, one more look. Michael couldn't resist the pull of seeing a little further, understanding a little more about what was coming. He climbed back to the attic as evening shadows filled the space and approached the mirror with Luna following despite her obvious reluctance. She'd stayed downstairs the first time, but now she climbed the ladder after him, her claws clicking on the rungs, unwilling to let him face whatever was up here alone. Michael stood before the mirror and focused his intention on seeing further than tomorrow. He wanted to see next week, wanted to understand whether the men in suits taking the mirror was beginning of something larger or just isolated incident. The mirror's surface rippled again, and a new scene resolved. He was seeing his house, but different. The Victorian looked cleaner, better maintained, with fresh paint and landscaped yard that suggested significant investment. Michael saw himself walking toward the front door, but this future Michael moved differently. His gait was smooth, natural, showing none of the slight hitch that marked his current movement with the prosthetic. Future Michael climbed the porch steps easily and entered the house, calling out to someone Michael couldn't yet see. The scene shifted to interior view, and Michael saw a woman emerge from what in his current reality was his barely furnished living room, but in this future appeared completely renovated. She was perhaps 30, with warm smile and obvious comfort in the space. Future Michael hugged her, and the familiarity of the gesture suggested this wasn't casual relationship, but something deeper, more established. Children appeared, 2 of them, boy and girl, perhaps ages 8 and 10. They ran to future Michael with excited chatter about school and friends, and he knelt to engage with them at their level, his prosthetic leg apparently no longer limiting his mobility. The scene was domestic and happy in ways that made Michael's chest tighten with longing for things he'd stopped hoping for since his injury and discharge. But then the scene shifted again, darker now, showing the same house but at night with emergency vehicles outside, lights painting the neighborhood in red and blue. Michael saw himself being loaded into an ambulance while paramedics worked on him, the woman from earlier crying and trying to follow, the children being held back by a neighbor. The scene was too chaotic to understand what had happened, but the urgency suggested serious medical emergency. Before Michael could see more, the vision faded and the mirror returned to showing simple reflection. He stood breathing hard, his heart rate elevated, trying to process what he'd just seen. 2 possible futures, one showing happiness and family he'd given up hoping for, the other showing medical crisis that might be consequence of that first future, or might be completely separate path. The mirror apparently didn't show single fixed future, but multiple possibilities, different timelines branching from his present depending on choices not yet made. That realization changed everything. If the future wasn't fixed, if seeing these visions meant he could choose which path to follow, then the mirror wasn't just showing destiny, but offering navigation through probability. But it also meant responsibility. Every choice he made from now on would move him toward one future or away from another. The knowledge he gained through the mirror would influence those choices, creating feedback loop where seeing the future changed the future he'd seen. Nathaniel's journal had mentioned this problem, describing how trying to avoid his predicted death had seemed to make that death more inevitable through the very actions he took to prevent it. Michael descended from the attic with more questions than answers, Luna staying close to his side. He fed her and made dinner for himself without appetite, his mind still caught on what he'd seen in the mirror. The happy domestic scene called to him, suggested path toward life he'd abandoned as impossible after his injury, but the emergency scene warned that pursuing that path might lead to catastrophe he couldn't predict or prevent. He tried to sleep, but managed only fitful dozing, his dreams filled with fragmented images from the mirror's visions. When his phone's alarm woke him at 6 a.m., Michael felt like he'd been awake all night, and according to what he'd seen in the mirror, today was when the men in suits would arrive, when his discovery of the mirror would become known to whatever agency or organization they represented. He spent the morning preparing, gathering Nathaniel's journal and his own photographs and documentation, trying to present as cooperative witness rather than someone with anything to hide. Around 10 a.m., 3 men in dark suits arrived at his door, exactly as the mirror had shown. Michael answered before they could knock, his foreknowledge allowing him to control the initial interaction. Mr. Torres? The lead man was perhaps 50, with graying hair and the bearing of someone used to authority. I'm Agent David Morrison, Historical Artifacts Division. We have reason to believe you may have recently discovered an item of interest to our department. May we come in? Michael had researched the Historical Artifacts Division after seeing the vision, found it was legitimate federal agency responsible for cataloging and preserving items of unusual historical or cultural significance, which apparently included mirrors that showed the future, though the public documentation never mentioned anything that specific. "You're here about the mirror," Michael said, not making it a question. "I found it yesterday in my attic. I was planning to report it, but you're here before I made the call." Agent Morrison's expression shifted slightly, surprise or possibly approval. "You were planning to report it. That's uncommon. Most people who discover items like the Blackwood mirror try to keep them secret, either from fear or from desire to exploit their properties. I saw you coming in the mirror, saw this conversation happening. Seemed pointless to pretend I didn't know what you wanted. You've already used it then. Looked ahead at today's events. Once, just far enough to see you'd be coming. I didn't want to see more until I understood what I was dealing with." Agent Morrison glanced at his colleagues, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then he returned his attention to Michael. "Mr. Torres, you've demonstrated unusual restraint and judgment. The Blackwood mirror has been lost for over a century, and we've been tracking its possible locations based on property records and historical documentation. Your cooperation in this matter is noted and appreciated. May we examine the mirror?" Michael led them up to the attic, Luna following the group with obvious suspicion. The agents examined the mirror carefully, taking measurements and photographs, occasionally consulting devices that looked like they measured electromagnetic fields or other properties Michael couldn't identify. Agent Morrison studied Nathaniel's journal while the others worked, reading selected passages with clear familiarity with the content. "So you've read this," he said to Michael, holding up the journal. "Yes, Nathaniel's warnings about trying to see too far ahead, about the weight of knowing your own future. It seemed like wisdom worth heeding. It is. We have case files on 14 individuals who've used precognitive mirrors or similar devices to see their futures. 8 of them suffered severe psychological distress from what they learned. 3 attempted to change their predicted deaths and died trying. Only 3 managed to use the knowledge productively, without suffering from the burden of foreknowledge. What made the difference? For the 3 who succeeded, they understood that seeing the future changes it, that the act of observation alters what's being observed. They used the mirrors to navigate possibility rather than trying to avoid destiny. They made choices informed by what they'd seen, but not dictated by it." Agent Morrison closed the journal and regarded Michael with assessment that felt thorough and somewhat invasive. "Mr. Torres, the federal government's position on precognitive devices is complex. We don't have clear legal framework for who owns them or what rights individuals have to use them. But we've developed protocols over decades of dealing with these situations. We catalog the devices, document their properties, and in most cases remove them to secure storage where they can't cause harm through misuse. You're taking the mirror. That would be standard procedure, yes, but your case is unusual. You've demonstrated restraint and cooperation, and you have legitimate claim to the mirror as property discovered on your land. We're authorized to offer an alternative arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" "You keep the mirror under controlled conditions with monitoring and regular documentation of any use. You receive training in safe observation protocols and psychological support to help process what you might see. And you provide the Historical Artifacts Division with reports on any significant visions or patterns the mirror reveals. In exchange, you retain ownership and have limited use of the device for personal purposes." Michael considered the offer while Luna pressed against his leg, her solid presence grounding him. The smart response was probably to let them take the mirror, to avoid the burden and responsibility that Nathaniel had warned against. But the vision of that possible future, the domestic happiness he'd seen, pulled at him with strength he couldn't easily dismiss. If the mirror could help him navigate toward that outcome, if it could guide him through choices that led to life worth living, wasn't that worth the risk? "What does limited use mean specifically?" he asked. "No more than once per week. Sessions not exceeding 30 minutes, focused on near-term futures within 1 month of present date. Long-range viewing creates too much cognitive load and increases probability of psychological distress. We've found weekly short-term sessions allow useful navigation without overwhelming the user. And you'd monitor everything. The mirror itself, yes. We'd install equipment that records when it's used and the general time frame being viewed. But we wouldn't monitor content of what you see. Your visions remain private unless you choose to report them." It was a better deal than Michael had expected, and the limitations actually appealed to him. Nathaniel had gone too far, had seen too much and had been destroyed by knowledge he couldn't handle. Controlled short-term viewing felt manageable, felt like tool rather than curse. "I accept," Michael said, "under the conditions you've outlined." Agent Morrison produced documents that formalized the arrangement, and Michael signed them while the other agents continued their examination of the mirror. They spent 3 hours installing monitoring equipment, small sensors attached to the mirror's frame, that Morrison explained would record activation events without capturing image data. They also provided Michael with extensive written protocols about safe viewing practices, warning signs of psychological distress, and contact information for support resources. Before they left, Morrison pulled Michael aside for final conversation. "Mr. Torres, I want to emphasize something that our protocols don't adequately convey. The future you'll see in this mirror isn't fixed. It's probability, possibility, potential outcome based on current trajectory. Every choice you make after viewing changes the future you've seen. This means you can't trust what you see as certainty, but you also can't dismiss it as mere fantasy. The mirror shows what might happen, and that knowledge gives you power to influence what will happen. Use that power carefully." "I will," Michael promised, though he wasn't entirely sure he understood the distinction Morrison was drawing. If the future changed based on his choices, how could he know whether what he saw was worth pursuing or avoiding? How could he navigate when the map kept shifting? The agents departed, leaving Michael alone with Luna and the mirror and the beginning of what he suspected would be the strangest chapter of his life. He stood in the attic for a long time after they left, looking at the mirror but not activating it, trying to process what he'd agreed to and what it would mean for his daily existence. Over the next weeks, Michael settled into routine with the mirror. Once per week, usually Sunday mornings, he'd climb to the attic and look ahead at the coming week. The visions were often mundane, showing him at the grocery store or working on house repairs or walking Luna through the neighborhood. But occasionally they'd show something significant, decision points or encounters that the mirror flagged as important through their mere appearance in vision. He learned to interpret the mirror's language, to distinguish between visions that showed high-probability futures versus low-probability alternatives. High-probability visions had clarity and detail, showed full scenes with sound and interaction. Low-probability visions were hazier, more fragmentary, suggesting paths that required significant choice changes to reach. The domestic future he'd seen in his first extended viewing appeared occasionally in these low-probability glimpses, always just out of reach, always suggesting possibility if he could figure out how to navigate toward it. 3 months into the arrangement, Michael was reviewing a vision of the coming week when he saw something that stopped his breath. The vision showed him at a coffee shop he didn't recognize, meeting with a woman who looked familiar though he couldn't place her. They were discussing something intense, leaning close across the table, and the woman was crying while Michael held her hand. The vision cut to later scene showing them walking through what looked like hospital corridor, both looking exhausted and worried. Michael tried to focus on details that would help identify the woman or understand the context, but the vision faded before he could learn more. He documented it per his protocol, noting date and rough timeline, then spent the week trying to understand what he'd seen. The coffee shop appeared to be in Portland, based on glimpsed street signs, and the hospital was probably Maine Medical Center based on architectural details. On Tuesday of that week, Michael was grocery shopping when he noticed a woman in the produce section who matched the one from his vision. She was younger than he'd initially thought, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back and the kind of efficient movements that suggested someone used to managing many responsibilities. Simultaneously, she was loading fruit into her cart while simultaneously talking on her phone about what sounded like medical scheduling. Michael almost approached her, then stopped himself. The vision had shown them meeting at a coffee shop, not a grocery store. If he forced the interaction here, would that change the future the mirror had shown? Would he still end up having the conversation the vision suggested was important? He let her finish her shopping and leave, then spent the evening trying to understand what the mirror wanted him to do. The next morning, following impulse he couldn't entirely explain, Michael walked to a coffee shop 3 blocks from his house that he'd never visited before. And there she was, the woman from the vision, sitting alone at a corner table, looking at her phone with expression that mixed worry and exhaustion. Michael ordered coffee and was carrying it to an empty table when she looked up and their eyes met. Something in her expression shifted, recognition or maybe just the acknowledgement of fellow human in distress, and she spoke. I'm sorry, this is random, but you look like someone who might understand what I'm dealing with. My daughter is sick, really sick, and I'm supposed to meet with her specialist today to discuss treatment options, but I'm so scared I can barely function. Do you mind if I just talk at you for a minute? I need to practice saying it out loud before the appointment. Michael sat down without conscious decision, pulled by the same inevitability that the mirror had shown. Of course, I'm Michael. Sarah. And thank you. I don't normally unload on strangers, but something about you feels safe. They talked for 90 minutes, Sarah describing her daughter Emma's diagnosis of rare autoimmune condition and the treatment protocol her doctors were proposing. Michael listened mostly, asking occasional questions, drawing on his own experience with medical systems and VA hospitals to provide what perspective he could. The conversation felt important in ways he couldn't articulate, felt like something the mirror had shown him, because this moment mattered. Before Sarah left for her hospital appointment, she gave Michael her number. I don't know why I'm doing this, but would you want to get coffee again? Maybe after I've talked to the doctors, I could use a friend who doesn't have all their own opinions about what I should do. Michael took the number and promised to text her, watching Sarah leave while his mind replayed the hospital corridor scene from his vision. Whatever was coming, whatever role he was meant to play in Sarah and Emma's story, the mirror had shown him this meeting was the beginning. Over the following weeks, Michael and Sarah became friends bonded by crisis and the strange comfort of finding someone who understood suffering without trying to fix it or minimize it. Emma's treatment was aggressive and difficult, and Sarah leaned on Michael for support through the worst days. He accompanied her to hospital visits when Emma's father couldn't get away from work, sat with her in waiting rooms while Emma underwent procedures, provided the steady presence that helped Sarah maintain composure when everything felt overwhelming. And through it all, Michael continued his weekly viewings with the mirror, watching as the low-probability domestic future began appearing more frequently and with greater clarity. The woman in those visions was Sarah, he realized. The children were Emma and a son Michael hadn't met yet. The house was his Victorian, renovated and filled with family in ways he'd stopped allowing himself to imagine. But the emergency scene appeared too, more frequently now, always showing the same moment of Michael being loaded into an ambulance while Sarah and the children watched in distress. The mirror was showing him two possible outcomes of the path he was walking: domestic happiness or medical catastrophe, or possibly both. The happiness interrupted by crisis he couldn't see clearly enough to understand or prevent. The uncertainty haunted him, made the weekly viewings feel more like burden than gift. He reported his observations to the Historical Artifacts Division as required, and they provided analysis, suggesting the medical emergency vision represented trauma from his past, rather than prediction of future. Their psychologist suggested Michael was projecting his own injury experience onto his developing relationship with Sarah, creating fear that happiness would be interrupted by disaster, because that pattern matched his lived experience. Maybe they were right. Michael wanted to believe they were right, but Nathaniel's journal had documented similar patterns, visions that showed happiness and tragedy intertwined, futures that delivered both promise and cost. The mirror didn't lie, but it also didn't explain, didn't provide context that would make interpretation easy or certain. 6 months after meeting Sarah, Michael realized he'd fallen in love with her, and probably had been falling since their first coffee shop conversation. Emma had responded well to treatment, was in remission, and beginning to reclaim normal childhood activities. Sarah had started smiling more, laughing at Michael's terrible jokes, touching his arm when they walked together in ways that suggested she felt something beyond friendship. He wanted to pursue it, wanted to let his feelings develop into something neither of them had explicitly acknowledged yet. But the emergency vision kept appearing in his weekly viewings, always showing the same moment of crisis, and Michael couldn't shake the fear that moving forward would lead to disaster for both of them. If you're invested in Michael's dilemma, wondering whether he should trust the mirror's warnings or risk everything for the chance at happiness it also shows him, you should definitely subscribe to see how this resolves, because the choice he makes will determine not just his future, but Sarah and Emma's as well. Give this a like if you're feeling the weight of impossible decisions along with Michael, and share it with someone who'd appreciate exploring whether knowing possible futures makes life easier or harder, when the futures you see contain both everything you want and everything you fear. The confrontation with his fear came unexpectedly during a late-night viewing session. Michael had been having trouble sleeping, worried about Emma's upcoming follow-up appointment, and about his own deepening feelings for Sarah. He climbed to the attic around 2 a.m. and stood before the mirror without clear intention about what he wanted to see. The mirror responded by showing him the emergency scene again, but this time the vision continued past the ambulance loading. He saw the hospital, saw Sarah sitting in a waiting room, looking exhausted and terrified. A doctor appeared and their conversation was silent, but the body language suggested news that wasn't terrible, but wasn't good either. Sarah nodded, stood, and was led to a recovery room where Michael lay in a hospital bed, awake but clearly unwell. They talked, hands clasped, and despite the obvious stress of the situation, there was also relief. Whatever had happened, Michael had survived it. The vision shifted forward in time, showing Michael back at his Victorian, but with significant medical equipment set up in what appeared to be a converted first-floor bedroom. Sarah was there, helping him with physical therapy exercises, and Emma was visible in the background doing homework at the dining room table. The scene was domestic and loving despite the medical complications, showing a family unit that had formed around and through crisis rather than being destroyed by it. Michael stood in the attic, breathing hard. His perspective on the emergency vision completely transformed. It hadn't been showing disaster that would destroy his chance at happiness. It had been showing the crucible through which that happiness would be forged and tested. The emergency was real, would probably happen if he continued on his current path, but it wasn't ending. It was a transition point, a challenge he and Sarah would face together rather than separately. The realization changed everything. The mirror wasn't warning him away from Sarah. It was showing him that their relationship would be tested, but would survive the testing. The emergency was part of the path toward the future he wanted, not an alternative to it. He descended from the attic with more clarity than he'd felt in months, and waited until morning to call Sarah. They met at their usual coffee shop, and Michael tried to find words for what he needed to say, without revealing he'd been seeing their possible futures in a magic mirror. He settled for simpler truth that didn't require explaining the impossible. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. I have feelings for you that go beyond friendship. I'm in love with you, have been for months. And I'm terrified, because I've spent the last 6 months watching you deal with Emma's illness and thinking I'd be adding complication to your life at exactly the moment you need simplicity. But I also think maybe we'd be better facing things together than separately, if you feel anything similar." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her expression cycling through surprise and something that might have been relief. "I've been in love with you since that first morning when you let me talk about Emma, without trying to fix anything or minimize what I was feeling. And I've been just as terrified as you are, thinking I didn't have space in my life for relationship when Emma needs so much attention and her father is barely present and my job is demanding and I'm already stretched too thin." "But," Michael prompted, hearing the word she hadn't spoken, "but maybe that's exactly why we need each other. Maybe trying to handle everything alone is making it harder than it needs to be." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I don't know what this looks like, Michael. I don't know how we fit relationship into all the other demands on our time and energy, but I want to try if you do." "I do," he said, and felt the future shift, felt the low-probability domestic vision gain solidity and weight as his choice moved him onto the path that led there. Their relationship developed over the following year, with the comfortable pace of people who'd been friends before becoming partners. Michael met Emma's father and negotiated the complicated dynamics of co-parenting. He spent time with Emma, building relationship with a 10-year-old who was smart and funny, and occasionally exhausting in the way children could be. Sarah spent time at the Victorian, gradually contributing to the renovations Michael had been attempting alone, her practical skills complementing his more theoretical approach to home repair. And Michael continued his weekly mirror sessions, watching the domestic future gain increasing clarity and detail. The emergency vision appeared less frequently, but never entirely disappeared, always hovering at the edge of possibility, like storm clouds on distant horizon. Agent Morrison checked in quarterly to review Michael's reports and assess his psychological state. The assessment remained positive, Morrison noting that Michael seemed to be using the mirror productively, navigating toward futures he wanted, rather than being paralyzed by fear of futures he wanted to avoid. 18 months after their coffee shop conversation, Sarah and Emma moved into the Victorian. The house had been renovated enough to accommodate them comfortably, and Emma's health remained stable enough that the move felt like progress rather than risk. Michael's life had transformed from isolated veteran managing chronic pain and post-service adjustment into something that looked remarkably like the vision he'd first seen in the mirror: domestic happiness in a well-maintained Victorian with people he loved. But the emergency vision appeared in his next mirror session after Sarah moved in, clearer than ever, showing details he'd missed in previous viewings. The medical crisis was a cardiac event, sudden and severe enough to require emergency surgery. The timeline suggested it would happen within the next few months, probably triggered by stress or undiagnosed condition. Michael saw himself coding in the ambulance, saw the chaos of emergency room, saw Sarah making decisions about his care with Emma crying in the background. He also saw the recovery, saw himself returning home, saw months of rehabilitation that were difficult but successful. The mirror was showing him complete arc now, from crisis through recovery to integration back into the family life they'd built. It wasn't avoidable, wasn't something he could prevent through different choices. It was simply what would happen, a challenge written into the future he'd chosen to pursue. Michael told Sarah about the vision, omitting the mirror's role, but describing it as premonition or intuition based on symptoms he'd been noticing. She insisted he see a cardiologist, and the examination revealed what Michael had suspected. His heart showed damage from injuries sustained during the explosion that had ended his service. The damage had been progressing slowly, compensated by his youth and generally good health, but it was reaching the point where intervention was necessary. The cardiologist recommended surgery, and Michael scheduled it for late fall, choosing to control the timing rather than waiting for the emergency the mirror had shown. Sarah took leave from her job to help with recovery, and Emma drew pictures that decorated Michael's hospital room and later his home recovery space. The surgery was successful, and while the recovery was difficult, having Sarah and Emma there made it manageable in ways Michael suspected it wouldn't have been if he'd faced it alone. 3 months after the surgery, Michael stood in his renovated Victorian kitchen, making dinner while Sarah helped Emma with homework at the dining room table. The scene matched the domestic future the mirror had shown him years earlier, down to specific details he remembered from those early visions. He'd navigated to this outcome deliberately, using the mirror to guide choices that led here, while accepting the challenges that came with the path. Agent Morrison visited a few days later for one of his quarterly assessments, and he noted the changes in Michael's life with clear approval. "You've accomplished what most mirror users don't, Mr. Torres. You've integrated the knowledge into your life productively without being controlled by it. You saw difficult futures and chose to face them, rather than trying to avoid them or being paralyzed by fear. That's the ideal use case for precognitive devices." "I had advantages," Michael said. "Military training that taught me to operate despite fear, a dog who kept me grounded, and luck in meeting people who were worth the risks I saw coming. Still, it's impressive. Most people see their potential futures and either become addicted to viewing, constantly checking and rechecking every decision, or they become so frightened of bad outcomes that they stop making decisions entirely. You found balance." They talked for over an hour about Michael's experiences and what lessons might be extracted for training future mirror users. Morrison revealed that the Historical Artifacts Division was developing formal protocols based on case studies like Michael's, trying to understand what factors allowed some people to benefit from precognition while others were damaged by it. After Morrison left, Michael climbed to the attic one final time to use the mirror. He focused his intention on seeing far ahead, beyond the 1-month limit Morrison had established, wanting to understand whether the domestic future he'd navigated toward was stable or temporary. The mirror showed him years ahead, decades forward, and what he saw brought tears to his eyes. He saw himself aging in the Victorian with Sarah beside him. He saw Emma growing up, graduating high school and college, eventually bringing home a partner of her own. He saw grandchildren running through rooms he and Sarah had renovated together. He saw Luna's successor, a border collie puppy that Emma convinced them to adopt. He saw himself and Sarah at 60, 70, 80 years old, still together in the house where it all began. But he also saw challenges woven through that future, medical issues that came with age, Emma's struggles with relationships and career choices, financial difficulties during economic downturns, arguments and tensions that marked any long partnership. The future wasn't perfect or easy. It was simply real, full of the normal mixture of joy and difficulty that marked a life actually lived. Michael ended the viewing and covered the mirror with its canvas shroud, understanding that he was done with precognition. He'd learned what he needed to learn, had navigated to the future he wanted, and continuing to view would only diminish his ability to live in the present. The mirror had been tool for specific purpose, and that purpose was complete. He reported his decision to Agent Morrison, who expressed understanding mixed with disappointment that he'd be losing his most successful case study. But Morrison also agreed that knowing when to stop viewing was as important as knowing how to view effectively. Michael signed documents transferring the mirror back to federal custody, and within a week, the agents returned to carefully remove it from his attic. Sarah asked about the mirror after the agents left, and Michael told her an edited version of the truth. He'd found something in the attic that belonged in a museum, had worked with the government to document it properly, and now it was going to the Smithsonian where it would be preserved for future study. Sarah accepted the explanation without pushing for details Michael couldn't provide, trusting that if he wanted to share more, he would in his own time. Life continued in the Victorian through seasons and years. Emma thrived, Michael's health remained stable, and Sarah's work as a social worker allowed her to help other families navigate medical crises the way she'd learned to navigate Emma's illness. The domestic routine that Michael had first glimpsed in the mirror became their daily reality, ordinary and precious in equal measure. Michael thought about the mirror occasionally, wondered if other people were using it now, learning to navigate their own futures with the same careful intention Morrison had taught him. He hoped they were successful, hoped they found the balance between knowledge and paralysis that had allowed him to benefit from precognition without being destroyed by it. Luna passed when she was 12, her body simply giving out one quiet morning while she slept beside Michael's bed. He buried her in the backyard with proper ceremony, marking the grave with a stone carved with her name and service dates. Emma cried during the burial, having grown to love the dog who'd been Michael's partner long before Sarah and Emma entered his life. They adopted the border collie puppy Michael had seen in his long-range vision, and Emma named her Luna too in honor of her predecessor. Years accumulated into decades, and Michael watched his vision of the future become his lived present. Every major event he'd glimpsed in the mirror eventually happened in reality, confirming the mirror's accuracy while also demonstrating how the path from present to future unfolded through countless small choices and adjustments. The future wasn't fixed destination, but emergent outcome of accumulated decisions, and knowing the general direction helped him navigate without eliminating the uncertainty that made life interesting. When Michael was 65, the Historical Artifacts Division contacted him with unexpected request. They were publishing a declassified history of pre-cognitive devices and wanted his permission to include his case as example of successful use. Michael agreed on condition that Sarah and Emma's identities be protected, and the resulting chapter in the government publication described his journey from discovery to domestic stability without naming the people who'd made that stability possible. The publication generated modest public interest, mostly among academics and historians, who'd long suspected such devices existed but had no official confirmation. Michael gave a few interviews to reputable journalists, carefully describing his experiences while avoiding any suggestion that precognition was simple or that everyone should want access to such knowledge. He emphasized the burden that came with foreknowledge, the responsibility to use information wisely, and the importance of accepting that even accurate visions of the future didn't eliminate the need for present courage. One interviewer asked Michael whether he regretted using the mirror, whether knowing his future had made his life better or worse than it would have been without that knowledge. He thought carefully before answering. The mirror showed me possibilities, not certainties. It showed me that happiness was achievable if I was willing to face the challenges that came with it. Without the mirror, I probably wouldn't have pursued relationship with Sarah because I was too scared of being burdened during Emma's illness. I would have stayed isolated, convinced I was protecting them by staying away. The mirror gave me courage to try, and that courage led to life I treasure. So no, I don't regret it. But I also don't think everyone should have access to precognition. It's a powerful tool that requires careful use, and not everyone is prepared for that responsibility. The interviewer published the response, and it became most quoted excerpt from the interview, appearing in articles about the ethics of precognition and the psychology of foreknowledge. Michael was invited to speak at universities and conferences, asked to share his experience with audiences who'd never considered the practical implications of seeing the future. He accepted some invitations and declined others, trying to balance the value of education against his preference for privacy. Through it all, Sarah remained his anchor and his partner, the person who'd been shown in the mirror's visions and who'd exceeded what the mirror could capture through her daily kindness and strength. Emma grew into adulthood with her own ambitions and challenges, eventually going into medicine inspired by the doctors who'd treated her childhood illness. And Michael's Victorian remained the center of their family life. Rooms full of memory and renovation, and the ordinary accumulation of years lived well. When Michael was 78, he received call from Agent Morrison, now retired but still maintaining interest in precognitive device outcomes. Morrison wanted to update Michael's file with information about his long-term psychological health and quality of life, hoping to strengthen the evidence that careful precognition use could be beneficial rather than harmful. They met at the coffee shop, where Michael and Sarah had first acknowledged their feelings for each other, and Morrison asked detailed questions about Michael's well-being across multiple dimensions. At the end of the interview, Morrison closed his tablet and looked at Michael with expression that mixed professional interest and personal warmth. "You know, in 40 years of working with precognitive devices, I've seen maybe a dozen people use them successfully. Most either become addicted to viewing and lose the ability to live in the present, or they become so frightened of bad outcomes that they stop making any significant decisions. You're one of the very few who found balance, who used the knowledge to enhance your life rather than being controlled by it. I wanted you to know that your case has influenced policy, has helped us develop better protocols for future users. Your success mattered beyond your own life. I appreciate that, but honestly I think I just got lucky. Lucky in the timing of the discovery, lucky in meeting Sarah when I did, lucky in having the military discipline that let me treat precognition as intelligence resource rather than magic oracle. A lot of things had to align for this to work out well. Maybe. But you also made good choices within the constraints you were given. That's not just luck." Morrison left, and Michael sat alone in the coffee shop for a while, thinking about the path that had led from that first morning with Sarah to this moment 3 decades later. The mirror had shown him possibilities, but he'd had to choose to pursue them, had to accept the challenges that came with the futures he wanted. The knowledge had been useful, but the courage to act on that knowledge had been his own contribution. If you followed Michael's journey from discovering the mirror to building a life informed by but not controlled by precognition, you might appreciate hearing from others who've thought about similar questions. Subscribe if you want to explore more stories about how knowledge of the future changes the present. Give this a like if Michael's experience resonated with your own thoughts about fate and choice, and share it with someone who'd enjoy thinking through the ethics and practicalities of precognition. These are the kinds of questions we need to discuss as technology and science keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible, and your engagement helps keep the conversation going. Michael's final viewing of the mirror had shown him living to age 84, passing peacefully with Sarah beside him and Emma visiting regularly. That future was still 6 years away as he sat in the coffee shop reflecting on Morrison's visit, still in the realm of possibility rather than certainty. But Michael found himself accepting it, trusting that the mirror's long-range accuracy would hold and that he'd have those years to continue the life he'd built. The acceptance brought peace he hadn't entirely expected, relief from the anxiety that had marked too much of his life during and after his military service. He'd spent years managing PTSD and chronic pain, fighting through days when getting out of bed felt impossible, and future seemed like burden rather than promise. The mirror had shown him future worth fighting for, and that vision had carried him through the difficult periods when nothing in his present suggested hope was reasonable. He returned home to find Sarah working in the garden they'd established in the backyard, plants replacing the lawn in sections that had taken years to develop. Luna, too, was lying in the shade watching Sarah work, the dog's presence a continuation of the partnership Michael had started with Luna decades earlier. Emma's car was in the driveway, suggesting she'd stopped by on her way home from the hospital where she worked in pediatric oncology. Michael joined Sarah in the garden, kneeling carefully to help with weeding despite the protests from his knees and back that came with age and old injuries. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind of shared quiet that decades of partnership allowed, not needing words to coordinate their efforts. Emma emerged from the house carrying lemonade and settled on the porch steps to watch them work. "You two are going to hurt yourselves trying to garden like you're still 40. "We're pacing ourselves," Sarah called back, "and the alternative is hiring someone to do it, which defeats the purpose of therapeutic gardening." "Therapeutic until someone throws out their back and ends up in my ER, Emma countered, but there was affection in her voice rather than real concern. The domestic scene was so close to what the mirror had shown Michael years ago that he had to pause and appreciate the strange arc his life had traced. From isolated veteran avoiding connection to family man working in his garden, while his wife and daughter bantered nearby, the transformation had been profound and earned through challenges the mirror had warned him about, but couldn't prevent. Later that evening, after Emma had left and Sarah was reading in the living room, Michael climbed to the attic one final time. The mirror was long gone, removed years ago, but the space where it had stood remained charged with memory. He stood in that spot and tried to remember what it had felt like to first see his reflection move independently, to first understand that he'd discovered something that violated every assumption about how time and causality worked. The memory was strong, but distant, separated from his present self by years of experience that had transformed the impossible discovery into tool he'd used and then released. He didn't miss the mirror exactly, didn't wish he still had access to precognitive viewing, but he appreciated what it had given him: permission to hope, courage to pursue connection despite fear, and framework for understanding that the future could be navigated rather than simply endured. He descended from the attic and found Sarah waiting at the bottom of the ladder. "You okay? You've been up there a while." "Just remembering, thinking about how much has changed since I bought this house." "Any regrets?" "None that matter. Some roads I didn't take, some versions of life I might have lived differently, but this version, the one I'm living with you and Emma, this is the one I'd choose again if given the option." Sarah kissed him gently. "Good, because you're stuck with this version now. All sales are final." They laughed together and moved to the living room where Luna too claimed the couch space between them, and they settled in for the quiet evening routines that marked their days. Michael thought about the long-range vision the mirror had shown him, about the years still ahead, and the eventual endpoint that waited for all of them. The knowledge didn't frighten him the way it had frightened Nathaniel Blackwood. It gave him appreciation for the time he had, and determination to use it well. The years continued their patient progression, each one bringing changes both anticipated and surprising. Michael's health remained relatively stable, though he accumulated the minor ailments that came with aging. Sarah developed arthritis that made her garden work more difficult, but she adapted by focusing on plants that required less intensive maintenance. Emma married a fellow doctor, and eventually had children of her own, bringing grandchildren into the Victorian for holidays and weekend visits. Michael thought about the mirror occasionally, wondered if it was being used by someone else now, or if it remained in government storage, catalogued and preserved but inactive. He hoped if it was being used, the user had good guidance and psychological support. Precognition was a powerful tool, but dangerous in the wrong hands or the wrong mental state. When Michael was 83, he received a package from the Historical Artifacts Division containing Nathaniel Blackwood's journal, which they'd decided to return to the house where it had been created. A note from Morrison's successor explained that the journal was no longer needed for active research, and that returning it to its point of origin seemed appropriate given Michael's successful stewardship of the mirror during his years of use. Michael read through the journal again, finding new appreciation for Nathaniel's warnings and observations now that he'd lived his own experience with precognition. Nathaniel had been destroyed by seeing too far ahead, by knowing his own death date and trying unsuccessfully to avoid it. Michael had been more fortunate, limiting his viewing to near-term futures and accepting that some challenges couldn't be avoided, only faced with courage and support. He added his own entry to the journal, writing in the margins since the original pages were full. His entry documented his discovery of the mirror, his controlled use of it with government oversight, and the outcomes that had resulted from that use. He described the domestic happiness he'd achieved, the medical challenges he'd faced, and the wisdom he'd gained about balancing knowledge of the future with presence in the present. He concluded with advice for whoever might read the journal next. The mirror shows possibility, not destiny. What you see is neither certain nor inevitable, but it does indicate probable paths forward from your current choices. Use this knowledge to navigate courageously, rather than to avoid fearfully. The future that looks most frightening might be the one that leads to growth and unexpected joy. And remember that seeing the future changes it. That observation influences outcome. You're not passive recipient of fate, but active participant in its creation. Choose wisely, act bravely, and accept that even perfect foreknowledge can't eliminate the uncertainty that makes life meaningful. Michael sealed the journal in waterproof case and returned it to the trunk in the attic, where he'd found it over 3 decades earlier. Whoever bought this house after he and Sarah were gone would find it there, along with documentation about the mirror's history and its eventual removal by the Historical Artifacts Division. The knowledge would persist even after those who'd lived it were gone, preserved for future generations who might face similar discoveries and need guidance for navigating them. His 84th birthday arrived quietly, marked by dinner with Sarah and Emma's family, cake with candles he couldn't quite blow out in a single breath, and presents that reflected how well his family knew him. The celebration was low-key and perfect, exactly what Michael would have chosen if offered unlimited options. Sarah had aged beside him with grace that made her more beautiful at 79 than she'd been at 34, her face showing the character that decades of living had carved there. That night, lying in bed beside Sarah with Luna too sleeping on the floor nearby, Michael thought about the long-range vision the mirror had shown him years ago. He'd seen himself dying peacefully at 84 with Sarah beside him, had seen the domestic ending to a life well lived. That future was now present, the vision approaching reality, and Michael found himself curious whether the mirror's accuracy would hold through this final prediction. He didn't fear it exactly, though the prospect of dying carried its own weight and uncertainty. But he'd had time to prepare, years to say things that needed saying and to shore up the relationships that would outlast him. Sarah knew he loved her. Emma knew he was proud of her. The grandchildren would have memories of him, even if those memories faded with time. His affairs were in order, his will updated, his wishes for end-of-life care documented and discussed with the people who'd need to make decisions. The mirror had shown him this approaching, and the knowledge had allowed preparation that made the present more peaceful than it might have been with less warning. That was perhaps the greatest gift precognition could offer, not the ability to avoid difficult futures, but the time to prepare for them, to face them with courage and acceptance rather than shock and denial. Michael died 3 months after his 84th birthday, passing peacefully during an afternoon nap, while Sarah read in the chair beside their bed. The end matched what the mirror had shown him: quiet, anticipated, mourned, but not tragic. Sarah held his hand as his breathing slowed and stopped, and Luna too pressed against the bed, sensing change she couldn't fully understand but responded to with the deep instinct that connected dogs to their humans across the boundary of language and species. The funeral was well attended, former soldiers from Michael's military service joining family and friends in celebrating a life that had been marked by service and survival, and the wisdom to use strange gift for good ends. Emma delivered a eulogy that captured her stepfather's journey from isolated veteran to family man, describing how Michael's courage to pursue connection despite fear had changed not just his own life, but hers and her mother's as well. Sarah scattered some of Michael's ashes in the garden they'd built together, mixing them with the soil that would nourish the plants they'd chosen and tended through years of shared work. The rest went in a plot beside Luna Wow's grave, marking another endpoint in the partnerships that had defined Michael's post-service life. Emma planted a tree over the spot, an oak that would grow slowly, but outlast several human generations, marking where a veteran who'd learned to navigate the future had found his final rest. In the attic of the Victorian, Nathaniel Blackwood's journal waited in its trunk for the next person who'd discover it and learn about the mirror that had shown the future to 2 men separated by over a century. The journal now contained both their stories, both their warnings and their wisdom, preserved for whoever might need guidance in navigating the strange responsibility that came with seeing what would come. Sarah lived another decade after Michael's death, remaining in the Victorian and maintaining the life they'd built together until her own health declined and Emma convinced her to move to assisted living facility. The house was sold to a young family who knew nothing of its history, with precognitive mirrors, or the men who'd use those mirrors to navigate toward futures worth living. The new owners discovered the journal during renovations, read it with fascination mixed with skepticism, and eventually donated it to the Historical Artifacts Division, along with note about the house's unusual history. The journal became part of the government's classified collection on precognitive devices, studied by researchers trying to understand how some people successfully used foreknowledge while others were destroyed by it. Michael's case remained the gold standard, the example that protocols were based on, and that training materials referenced when preparing new users for the psychological demands of seeing the future. And somewhere in government storage, the Blackwood mirror sat in a climate-controlled vault, waiting for the next person who'd be given controlled access to its visions. The mirror would outlast everyone who'd ever used it, would continue showing futures to viewers separated by centuries, would persist as tool and warning and invitation to anyone brave or foolish enough to want knowledge of what was coming. The legacy Michael left wasn't just in his family or his military service or even his successful use of precognition. It was in the understanding he'd developed and documented about how to live with knowledge that most humans weren't designed to carry. The future was always coming, whether you could see it or not, and the challenge wasn't avoiding it but meeting it with courage and wisdom earned through experience. Emma became the keeper of her stepfather's story, the person who remembered and could explain what Michael had learned during his years with the mirror. She gave occasional lectures at medical ethics conferences about foreknowledge and informed consent, using Michael's experiences to illustrate complex questions about whether people should have access to information about their possible futures. The conversations were always nuanced, always acknowledging both benefits and costs, always emphasizing that knowledge alone was insufficient without the wisdom to use it well. Michael's grandchildren grew up hearing stories about the grandfather who'd found something impossible in his attic and had used it to build the family they'd been born into. The stories took on mythic quality through retelling, details smoothed and enhanced, until the truth was hard to distinguish from embellishment. But the core message remained. Courage mattered more than certainty. Connection was worth the risk of loss, and the future could be navigated if you were willing to face what was coming rather than hiding from it. The Blackwood mirror showed new futures to new users, each one learning in their own time and their own way what Michael had learned through years of careful viewing. Some succeeded, using the knowledge productively to navigate toward lives they wanted. Others failed, becoming addicted to viewing or paralyzed by fear of what they'd seen. The mirror remained neutral, showing what it showed without judgment or guidance, leaving interpretation and choice to the humans who stood before it. And in Portland, Maine, the Victorian that had housed the mirror for over a century continued its life as family home, different families bringing different stories, but all of them living above the attic, where two men separated by time had both discovered that seeing the future changed nothing about the need to live courageously in the present. The mirror's legend grew slowly in the classified community that knew about precognitive devices, Michael's case becoming cautionary tale about the importance of psychological preparation and support. Training protocols evolved, screening became more rigorous, and the number of people given access to such devices decreased as the government recognized that most individuals lacked the combination of discipline, wisdom, and emotional stability required to benefit from foreknowledge. But for those few who did receive access, who demonstrated the qualities that suggested successful use, Michael's documented experiences served as roadmap and inspiration. His journey from fearful isolation to domestic courage, from questioning every vision to accepting that some futures were worth pursuing despite their challenges, provided template for how precognition could enhance life rather than diminishing it. Decades after Michael's death, the Historical Artifacts Division published a full declassified report on precognitive devices, including detailed analysis of successful cases. Michael's story anchored the report, demonstrating that under the right conditions with the right support, seeing the future could be beneficial rather than harmful. The report generated public debate about whether such devices should exist at all, whether humanity was ready for the responsibility they represented, whether the potential benefits outweighed the certain risks. The debate, never resolved, remained philosophical argument without clear answer, but it kept the questions alive in public consciousness. And that awareness served its own purpose, preparing people for the possibility that someday technology or discovery might make precognition widely available, forcing society to develop frameworks for managing knowledge that previous generations had considered impossible. Emma was interviewed for the historical report, providing family perspective on Michael's experiences. She described growing up with stepfather, who'd used a mirror to navigate toward the future that included her, explained how Michael's foreknowledge had influenced his parenting and his relationship with her mother, offered perspective that no amount of scientific analysis could capture. "He never told me directly about the mirror," Emma said in the interview, "but I figured it out eventually, pieced together hints and overheard conversations, and the way he seemed to know things before they happened. What struck me most was how he used that knowledge. He didn't try to control everything or prevent every problem. He just made sure he was present for the moments that mattered, that he said the things that needed saying, that he showed up when we needed him. The foreknowledge didn't make him perfect, but it made him intentional. And that intentionality shaped how I think about my own life and choices now." The interview captured something essential about Michael's legacy, the way his experience with precognition had rippled outward through his relationships and influenced people who'd never seen the mirror themselves. Knowledge of the future had practical value, but its deeper value was in the perspective it provided on the present, the reminder that today's choices created tomorrow's reality. And maybe that was the final lesson Michael had learned and passed on through his documented experiences and his family's memories. The future was always uncertain despite any visions that claimed to reveal it. But uncertainty wasn't permission to avoid choosing or acting or risking connection. It was invitation to live deliberately, to make choices informed by wisdom rather than fear, to accept that some futures were worth pursuing even when you knew the challenges they'd bring. If you've made it through this exploration of precognition and the choices it forces, you've probably wondered what you'd do with access to a mirror like Michael's. Would you look? Would you trust what you saw? Would you have the courage to pursue the futures that looked good despite the challenges they contained? These are the questions that matter as we move toward a future where technology keeps expanding what's possible and forcing us to decide what's wise. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring these questions through stories that make them real and personal. Give this a like if Michael's journey made you think about your own relationship with uncertainty and choice, and share it with someone who needs to hear that courage matters more than certainty, that knowing the future doesn't eliminate the need to live bravely in the present. These are the conversations that prepare us for whatever comes next, and your engagement keeps them going. The Blackwood Mirror remained in government custody, its future unclear but its past thoroughly documented. Michael's story had become part of that documentation, preserved in classified files and declassified reports, studied by researchers and taught to anyone given access to precognitive devices. His success rate remained unmatched. His psychological stability through years of viewing remained model that others were measured against. But the mirror itself was silent, waiting in its climate-controlled storage for the next person who'd stand before it and choose to see what was coming, waiting for someone else who'd need its guidance or its warnings, waiting patiently as only inanimate objects could wait, ready to show the future to anyone brave enough to look. And somewhere in that future the mirror might show, Michael's story persisted as lesson and legacy, proof that some people could handle knowledge that most couldn't, that courage and wisdom and support made possible what would otherwise destroy. The story would outlast everyone who'd known Michael personally, would become historical example that future generations studied without understanding the full weight he'd carried or the choices he'd made to navigate toward life worth living. But the essence would remain, the truth that mattered. The future was always coming, could sometimes be seen, and could always be influenced by the choices people made in the present. Michael had learned that truth through his years with the mirror, had demonstrated it through the life he'd built, and had passed it on through the family and the documentation that survived him. That was enough. That was everything. And it endured long after the man himself had passed into the same future he'd once seen reflected in glass, that showed what would be as clearly as what was.